Good evening, everyone. Chris has asked me to lecture to you on some of the most remote antiquity of our species. And in fact, we're not even going to touch on humans as we understand them. We're a relatively recent phenomenon. We're probably no more than about 120 to 150,000 years old, even though some of the recent studies are suggesting humans, that is us, anatomically modern humans, which you will see abbreviated to AMH in some of the literature, or Homo sapiens sapiens. Some are suggesting that we emerged about 98,000 years ago. So what we're going to be looking at in this lecture, and largely in the following lecture next week, are species that are affine to us, but they're largely evolutionary dead ends. There's behavior that we share in common with them, and we've been trying to understand their relationship to us with genetic studies of various sorts and so on. So we will have no direct evidence of this in Northumberland nor in Scotland. And in fact, most of Britain affords very little evidence, not because these people were not necessarily here, but because of the advance of the last glacial ice sheets would have destroyed all the evidence for it. So when we do have the early hominid evidence, and we call these things homonyms or hominids, almost all the evidence that we have is displaced to the extreme south of England. And the reason for that is because that is beyond the maximum extension of the glacial ice sheets. So the evidence survives there. So you may know of some of these sites, called Box Grove and so forth. These are 500,000 years old. There's recently been one about 750,000 years old. But today we're going to push back about 7 to 10 million years ago. And this is largely going to concern Africa. So we're going to be somewhere out here in our famous cultural succession of or evolutionary succession. Can I get the next slide, please? Now, we are primates. We share a tremendous number of commonalities with primates of various sorts, and our nearest relative is the chimpanzee. And by doing these studies of the higher primates, here we are, chimpanzees and gorillas. We're a specific we've emerged from a specific higher African primate strand. And this is a distribution of the primates, and you will read some of the new literature on this is suggesting primates actually emerged in Eurasia, migrated into Africa, and maybe 25 million years ago. And we've gone on parallel courses. And then, of course, there's the New World primates and so forth. But it's very clear from genetic studies, from anatomical studies and so forth, that the higher primates of the Old World, namely Africa, is where our origins lie. That's not to say that we don't see some similarities with orangutans and so forth that are displaced into East Asia, but looking at their genetics and looking at their physiological attributes, we belong in this African strand here rather than the gibbons and the orangutans and so forth. We have other evidence that is strongly suggestive of our nearest relation, being the chimpanzee, and that comes from genetics, where we share in the order of 95% of our DNA codes with chimpanzees. So they are our nearest analogues. But of course, there are some fundamental distinctions in the DNA, and those that have been studying the human evolution or the primate evolutionary sequence have suggested that we began to diverge from chimpanzees somewhere about 10 million years ago. So in our studies of trying to understand the emergence and behavior of our early hominid ancestors, we take a known, which is the chimpanzee behavior, and we have recently seen a tremendous advance in our studies of chimpanzee behavior, which I'll try to summarize for you. One of our local scholars at the University of Stirling, Dr. Stafford, he has been doing a tremendous amount of research on this, proof that they make stone tools, they have cultural peculiarities according to the chimpanzee group that they derive from. So we'll look at this, and then on the other side, the next known that we have are very simple hunter-gatherers, like the Kalahari Bushmen, the Inuit, the Cree Indians, and so forth. And we think between these 2 points, we might be able to infer something about the behavior of our remotest ancestors.
which are not even human, strictly speaking, at next. So here is our chimpanzee ancestor. Pantroglodytes is his name, about 30 centimeters tall. Their longevity is very similar to humans. They live 60, 70 years on occasion, in captivity in particular. They can have intelligence levels to a 5 or 6 year old. Some of you might have heard of kanzi and various different chimpanzees that have been taught sign language, and they're able to communicate at the level of a 5, 6 year old child, possibly a 7 year old child. Some have suggested able to show abstract thought. A chimpanzee is one of the very few animals that recognizes their own reflection in the mirror. They know it's that. Instead of your dog barking at the mirror, as my dog does, they actually know this is a reflection of them. It's not someone else there. And they communicate through very, very subtle facial gestures at the same time. But above and beyond this, they're social creatures. They're organized into little family bands. And what's most fascinating for us, which is something that has emerged really in the last 20 years of research, is that they produce stone tools. And these are stone tools that are actually from an archaeological excavation of a chimpanzee site in West Africa. And these are tools where they have sat and smashed them together and opened them. So this is very interesting for the studies of our earliest ancestors. Why is that even something that is a species that is removed from us by about 10 million years was already producing tools of various sorts. Now these are just the stone tools, and we will have a special bias towards the stone tools whenever we discuss these periods, because we're looking at sites that are over 1 million years old, in some instances over 2 and 3 million years old. The only thing that will survive are tools, the stone tools in particular. But we mustn't forget that chimpanzees also use leaves to collect termites and water and pour them into their mouths, and they break nuts with wood and so forth. So they have a tremendous amount of dexterity and intelligence in this regard. And just to give you a sense of some of their social relationships, as we can see with the facial gestures, they very much approximate human facial gestures. And in fact, chimpanzees can recognize if we're upset or happy and so forth. Now, many psychologists have suggested that we have 60% or so of our communication, if not more, is non-verbal. It's transmitted by facial gestures, body language, tone of voice, and so forth. And we may or may not necessarily be conscious of what we're doing. And this is certainly true for the chimpanzees, that they can convey an immense amount of information in that. They live in little bands, as you see here, usually with a dominant male, that is the alpha male, that is the center of it. And the alpha male people, well, the other chimpanzees groom them and so forth to curry favor and also to consolidate the social network. So this seems to be the very, very basic higher primate social organization that we see. The image that you see on your bottom right reflects what we've only recently discovered, that about 5 to 10% of the chimpanzee diet is actually meat. For many, many years, we assumed that it was entirely vegetarian. We now know that chimpanzees hunt, and they do organized hunting. This is another great insight by Dr. Stafford at the University of Stirling, where in his studies he found that they do organized hunts, and they communicate by hoots and hand gestures to trap little animals and to kill them. And they take in this very important high protein sustenance into their diet. Next one. Now, of course, if we're going to make tools, we need the very basic physiological accoutrements to make them, and that is our hands. And this simple gesture is do you remember what that's called, Chris? Interdigitation. Anyways, being able to put your index finger to your thumb is something that only humans and chimpanzees can do. And that is the basis of a lot of our manual dexterity. So again, these are things that indicate to us Homo being us. There's the chimp, there's the gorilla. That other primates definitely have thumbs and so forth, but we have the manual dexterity. Of course, that's very important for fine work. And again, it underscores the continuity that we have with the chimpanzees. Now, when we depart from the chimpanzees, we are not certain. It's been set between 10 and 12 million years ago, and what's the intervening species has always been called the missing link, and it has remained missing. But we have some very good candidates that have filled in the gap in time in species types. I'll get the next one. Now, this is the distribution of chimpanzees. They are chiefly a West African phenomenon, and they are associated with tropical rainforests. Now, why haven't chimpanzees evolved in the same direction as maybe some of the other hominids? Well, partly is they're very well adapted to this environment. So if they remain in this environment, there isn't an external pressure to move them forward in evolution. Also, they have probably evolved, and we need to be sensitive to that. Even culturally, animals like chimpanzees may evolve. They may learn from other chimpanzees and so forth. It has been suggested that a chimpanzee, from these studies that the University of Stirling had undertaken, they learn from the mother, and if they do not learn within the first 18 months, they cannot learn. So there must be a threshold in the brain of a chimpanzee. So it assumes that there's a matrilineal sequence of knowledge and so forth. Now this is quite interesting because we've got these deep tropics and we've got Central and West Africa, and it's more or less the opposite of where our hominid ancestors first evolved. And I'll try to explain why that is significant to us. See, here they are, image of what some of these archaic hominids. They're probably this size and so forth. Not too tall. So. Now, most of these early sites of hominids do not occur in West Africa. They occur here in East Africa, and as we'll see, on the edges of the jungles of the very north of Africa. Now, this is partly just an issue of visibility for archaeologists. It's very difficult to survey for remains, fragmentary remains, and do bear in mind that we're looking at maybe 5 or 6 bones. It defines a species in some instances. That we have a rift valley that the Nile partly follows, that runs through East Africa. And because it's a nice rift valley, we can look into the layers very, very deep, and we can extract these bones. Moreover, East Africa is extremely arid, so these bones become fossilized, whereas you have the very acidic, fertile jungle soils of West Africa. Moreover, you don't have the deep inside valleys and so forth that would allow us to dig down. It's like, for instance, if we said to you that somewhere in Northumberland there are 3 bones of an early hominid, where will we look? How would you look for it? So archaeologists have focused largely on this area. So our discussions about where early hominids first evolved is very much biased towards where we're able to do some studies. And I'll show you some excellent work that the French in particular have been doing in Chad. But Africa at this time, and we're looking at about 7-8 million years ago, is not terribly similar to what we can see nowadays. Of course, there is a central jungle portion, but much of what we now associate with the Sahara Desert and so forth is actually a rather lush savanna environment. So it's not nearly as inhospitable and marginal as we would suspect it to be if we cite things like Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, and so forth. We associate that with extreme aridity, very few resources. It couldn't be further from the truth in these more remote times. And we think this is quite significant because the chimpanzee is very well adapted to that jungle environment, sitting under the foliage, the canopy of the jungle trees. These early species had to evolve rather differently. And we believe that the savanna is expanding a little bit. And where we currently see these species emerge is on the edge of the jungle areas. So, and the edge of the jungle areas means that they're coming down from the trees. And remember the size of some of these things. They're about this big. They're not exactly the most frightening predators you would imagine at this size. They are under great threat. And we look at things like Australopithecines from Schwatkotz in South Africa. And we have holes in the skulls of these Australopithecines where saber-toothed tigers have picked them up and taken them away. So you can imagine an animal about this size is easy prey. They survive by being able to cooperate and so forth, but also coming down from the trees and collecting at the edge of the jungle, they have to stand upright, much like the meerkat, to be able to see danger and also to move very, very quickly. So we're very interested in what is called the development of bipedalism, is to stand upright and walk on two legs, two-leg locomotion and so forth. And some French scholars doing some work at Lake Chad, which is more or less the edge of the Sahara, came up with this rather remarkable find, Sahelanthropus chadensis it's called, or more commonly Tumayan, because it's by Lake Tumai. And it doesn't look like a great deal, it's a small skull like this, but the most vital thing about it is the dating that we have puts it at 7 million years ago. And because the vertebral column went directly into the skull at a right angle, it indicates that it's bipedal. So already about 7 million years ago. So notionally we depart from the chimpanzee about 10 million years ago. At about this age, we begin to pick up a bipedal species living at the edge of the rainforest. And we think it's a specific adaptation to the rainforest. Well, sort of the retraction of the rainforest, expansion of the savanna. And the reason that they're out there standing upright is for defense. And also we assume that there are going to be different resources that are available to these early species. And we're going to follow this through a couple of these species. And quite surprisingly, for many of you that haven't followed this here, you probably remember the very important studies of Lewis and Mary Leakey at Olduvai Gorge and so forth, that was putting human tool production back to Homo habilis about 1.9 million years. Now we've actually pushed it here to about 2.6 million years ago. And the earliest tools were made by Australopithecines. And the earliest sites are in Ethiopia and Angola. And we've got these little tools that are produced. So it's a very arbitrary distinction to call a Homo, our genus, something called Australopithecine, which is southern ape. The reason they called it Homo habilis, man, the toolmaker or handyman, in Latin was based on this assumption that it was the earliest one, and it's not. So we're right around here. This strange thing called Australopithecine Barhi is our earliest toolmaker. But we're well on the way at this point. We've got the hands free, we've got bipedalism, and we begin to see also a movement to bigger eyes and frontal cortex development. Now, the thing with human evolutionary studies, it tends to be very philosophical because we're looking at what makes us distinctly human. Also, when we cite these different species, here is a species, Sahelanthropus chadensis, of which we have only one specimen. As we move up to some of these other ones, we might have 20 specimens. 30 specimens. It's not statistically reliable in any sense, not remotely representative at all. So there's a tremendous degree of arbitrariness in our decision of what is important. Also, when we look at these remains, remember how terribly fragmented they are. I'll show you a couple of instances. We've got fragments of a wrist, fragments of a foot, and what the scholars do is they create models of how that foot would connect to the knee, and how the knee would connect to the hip, with an absence of great deal of evidence on it. So it's extraordinarily speculative research. There are, in fact, more people that study early human evolution than there are single remains of bones from these periods. This is just to give you a sense of this. There has been an explosion of interest in research that emerged in the last 20 years. And this is largely because we are now able to apply very different techniques to these studies, like for instance studying our own DNA codes and working some mutations backwards. And some of you may have followed on these rather exciting studies concerning Neanderthal DNA and so forth that have recently been done by the Max Planck Institute. In Asia in particular, China, Southeast Asia, they've been doing some extremely exciting research on early hominids, and they're pushing them very, very far back. But we still have this terrible bottleneck of having so few skeletal remains in the entire world. So we're connecting points of light to create a constellation. It's not like you have a wonderful background of evidence. It's just little points that you're trying to connect these lines. And this is why it's changing so terribly much. We don't necessarily know the relationships, and particularly with Australopithecines. As some areas, Australopithecines expand, we see a retrograde motion where they move back towards apes. So where do we sit in this? Which one was implicated in our direct ancestry in this regard? Can I get the next? So here is the one that follows on from Sahelanthropus, and we're looking at about 5 million years, 6 million years old, and this is Ardipithecus. And there are a few more studies, or a few more of these, 6 to 5 million years. Again, they're bipedal. We assume they're hairy. There's no necessarily good reason that they have to be, but we assume it takes a while for that to be worked out as through natural selection in these species. And that is what represents Ardipithecus ramidus. Those are the bones. So you can see the rather imaginative connections of, if you have a metacarpal that is like this, your connecting wrist must be like this, and then they come with these images of how they would have stood, how they would have walked, and so forth. So don't necessarily trust the scholarship as being objective. It is the best argument that can be made on a very poor data set. I don't mean to criticize a lot of what they do, because how else are you going to go about this kind of research? You will always have fragmented remains in here. And it is quite interesting that the greatest insights that we have had on human evolution in the last 20, 30 years has actually come from studies of DNA and amino acid racemization of modern humans. And archaeology and paleoanthropology in particular has had to play catch up and changes arguments. Like, for instance, 30 years ago, we would have said Homo erectus moved out of Africa, and then it developed in Europe into Neanderthals, and then they developed into modern Europeans, whereas in Asia, they would have developed into modern Asiatic populations. Now we recognize that Neanderthals were an evolutionary dead end. So was Homo erectus, and there's another wave that sweeps out of Africa that condemns all of these to largely oblivion. And therefore, most of our DNA, we share this because we go back to about anywhere between 98 and 150,000 years ago. We were all in Africa. That's it. But even that, bear in mind, will be changed, because some are arguing that we kept the Neanderthal DNA. But how much of that is ancient DNA represents our earliest history as a species? We're not sure at all. But here's Ardipithecus, and then you'll probably remember the name of Australopithecus, which follows it, and then the genus Homo. And we've got right around here the late Australopithecus are the first ones to make tools. And as you can see, a lot of these sites are coming from this particularly arid, high relief area of Ethiopia, Sudan, Djibouti, Somalia, and so forth. There's been a tremendous amount of interest in whether they could have reached the Arabian Peninsula, because with lower sea levels at some point, it's just a little river that would have gone through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. Try as much as they like, they have not found any of that evidence, but Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and so forth, massive sand dunes that have covered these things, you can see the practical challenges in being able to find that sort of data. Try to get the next one, please. here are a few things that exercise our interests in early hominid evolution. If you look at this succession of them, this is generally associated with who we are. Maximum height, that are direct ancestors. Maximum height 1 to 1.4 meters, 30 to 60 kilograms, 4 to 500 cubic centimeter brain capacity. Its distribution extends through east to southern Africa. But there's been this argument about teeth and jaws, because of course what you eat will influence the nature of your dentition and so forth. And also this movement towards a flattening face. It sounds like a strange, obscure discussion to be having. But of course, if you're relying largely on your olfactory senses, meaning smell and so forth, and like a dog, you have a long snout and you move to bite things all the time. If you're using tools, you don't do that. And that releases a tremendous amount of energy for the frontal cortex development, which for us is associated with symbolic activity, language, emotion, culture, and so on. And so we're looking at that point where the face begins to flatten a little bit, which is called, in the strict nomenclature, we call it prognathism, and the ability to develop that frontal cortex. This is possibly the best known one. That is as good as it's ever been for human hominid remains. That's Lucy, as you might remember from East Africa. And that's the distribution of Australopithecines. So currently you can see it's an extremely Eastern South African phenomenon. However, bear in mind that we could not find that in West Africa except under the most extraordinary conditions because of the jungle and the flat, well, it might not necessarily be flat, but the tremendous deposition of sediment in there. We can follow the Rift Valley through East Africa. So that's definitely biased the evidence in that regard. And if you recall where Sahelanthropus or Tumai man was at some very northern extreme, we wouldn't have known that even 10 years ago, for instance. So this is probably occurring all the way around the rainforest. At the same time, this adaptation, these species are emerging out of a parent species of some sort. There was a very interesting argument that was made, I'm trying to remember the book now. Many of you would probably have heard the argument suggesting that before we evolved into the ancestors of humans, we spent time in the water. And it sounds like a far-fetched argument, but there are a couple of things that recommend it. One of them is that what we desperately need for higher neurological evolution is omega-3 fatty acids. And oddly enough, they are largely found in marine foods rather than terrestrial foods. So why do we need that? Why is our brain so reliant on it? And the other part of this argument that they have is they say, well, this diversification is certainly happening in East Africa, but what about on the West African side? What if they are exploiting the coast and they're taking in these resources and so forth? Because it is a rather fascinating thing that human infants can swim right from birth and so on. It's a compelling argument. There's a great deal of cogency to it. The only thing missing is the evidence. But the evidence, the lack of evidence, rather, is certainly possibly explained by just the physiological characteristics of Western Africa. But it is certainly something that we shouldn't necessarily sneer at as much as we did when the book first came out, because there is no getting around the argument for the omega-3 fatty acids, and they're extremely significant in our neurological development. Now we'll get to the first tool makers in here. And this is the kind of environment that the archaeologists are surveying. It looks not terribly nice, and it's brutally hot, it's arid, and so forth. They look at temperatures of almost 50 degrees centigrade in portions of East Africa. But as you can see with the erosion that has occurred, you can go down and survey levels and get a sense of where cultural material may be. And then they ferret through these deposits, and then they find little fragments of bone and so forth. It's a sparsely inhabited landscape. As you look there, where would you begin? There is no easy way to begin, and they just go from valley to valley, and they extract all the data that they possibly can. So this is where they concentrated most of their efforts, and we've got largely small handfuls of stone tools and the fossil remains. But unfortunately, because of the tremendous antiquity of these things, it is just the stone tools. It's very rare that you get any formal evidence. We can say almost nothing about human behavior except by analogy. Human behavior, hominid behavior, except by analogy. Now this is the first tool maker. This represents possibly the greatest achievement in the movement from what are essentially apes to what begins the line onward to us in one way or another. It dates between about 2.6 and 2.5 million years ago. It's known as Australopithecus garhi, but again, how is that even a genuine? Is it a justified species designation? It's unequivocally associated with stone tool production, and most of the sites are found in Ethiopia, in Gona, and in Buri. And these tools are very similar to what Lewis and Mary Leakey had found at Olduvai Gorge, which is so rightfully famous. It was the first site that pushed human antiquity well beyond a million years ago, and we looked at that and we regarded it as 1.8, 1.9 million years. So we're more than a million years older now, and the first tools are being produced in East Africa. And curiously enough, they're being produced by a different species. And we see the same kinds of tools produced by different species. So how are they communicating, and how is this knowledge being transmitted? We don't particularly know. Is it because do they even have a language? We're not sure. We assume that there must be some form of communication, but then again, chimpanzees can communicate, but it doesn't constitute a genuine language. So we're not absolutely certain. But here is all we have from the bones pieced together. Cranial vault, big eye sockets, dentition that's not terribly dissimilar to Ardipithecus that preceded it. It's showing a greater variety of vegetables and high silica food, so they're eating grasses, they're sitting at the edge and so forth. And the tools largely look like things that they're just cutting bone and chopping grasses and so forth with. Lots of this, we love to discuss these things, teeth and brain capacities. About 90% of all the reports are constituted by these studies. But there is a logic to this in a perverse way, and that is that we assume that dentition changes very rapidly to accommodate changes in diet. So if we see huge changes in our dentition in a rapid, well, in a very rapid framework, we assume that diet has changed quite profoundly. To give you a sense of how profound these changes have been, did anyone here have braces when they were young? Orthodontic trouble? Yes, I had them as well. There were no orthodontic problems before the introduction of agriculture in Europe. Never, in any of the archaeological records. It is a response, an adaptive response to agriculture, to our diet. So we have people, and quite a substantial number of people, I don't know if it would be 1 in 20, 2 in 10, so 20% or so, that in less than 10,000 years, we have seen massive changes in our dentition. So when we're looking at these early species, and we're looking at changes that occur in their dentition and so forth, they can happen extremely quickly. And it's often obscured because we go between 2.6 and 2.5 million years. Remember, that's 100,000 years. 100,000 years ago, modern humans might be starting their first movement out of Africa. That's a long, long time, but it's easily obscured when you put a point, 2.6, 2.5 million years ago. lots of things can change in dentition. And dentition can change quite profoundly too when you start to use tools. Because suddenly you can process things, you can remove things that will accelerate your dental evolution in one direction or another. And one of the most important things that we're very keen on establishing in antiquity is when did we begin to use fire to cook food. And there's a very good book that was written, a very popular book, and it was about the introduction of fire. And it made some points that deserve to be restated quite often. You need 80% fewer calories to process or digest food that has been cooked than it is raw. By having that, by saving that sort of calorific expenditure to digest your food, you have calories for other developments. And you might be interested to hear that do you know what organ uses the vast majority of your calories? Brain, yes. So it's been associated fire and brain growth because those two, suddenly you will be able to have calories that are released for brain development and neurological development and so forth. So this is something that we're very keen on establishing here, the antiquity of this. Now, obviously, it's going to be terribly difficult to find the original hearth and how that emerged. But we do have proxy evidence of when the first the first fire begins. And it certainly is almost 2 million years old. And the reason I can say that is the earliest site out width of Africa, clearly out width of Africa, actually occurs in Georgia, a site called Dilanisi. And that's been dated to 1.88 million years ago. It sits in the Caucasus Mountains. And to be able to move to the Caucasus Mountains and to survive in the Caucasus Mountains, you need to be able to have fire. We also have some sites in the Riwak Valley in Pakistan, slightly more controversial because they're not clearly associated with any human or hominid remains. But certainly sites like Trinum in Java and so forth will show a movement across it. It might be as old as 2 million years ago. We assume that fire must have come around 2 million years ago or older. And this is accelerating certain aspects of brain development and, of course, dentition. So this is, of course, why we try to merge the studies of anatomy with studies of culture, tool development, fire, and so forth, because we think that's a vital thing in triggering certain developments in dentition, neofrontal cortex development, and so forth that are absolutely vital for the development of humans. So here's Goma, here are the images, and there you can see where Goma sites are in the Awash Valley. Now they extend from 2.6 to 1.5 million years ago, but the oldest tools are certainly 2.6 million years ago, and they're based on something called choppers. And we actually have choppers in Britain. Clacton, the Clactonian industry used to be called the chopper industry. We'll talk about that next week. I know many of you will not associate Clacton-on-Sea with early archaeological culture or any culture whatsoever. It was the oldest spear at one point that was found there. But this persists for an extremely long time as chopper, and it is the most simple way of producing a tool. And what it is, it's splitting a stone and then just using it to chop to break what we presume is bone or grasses and cereals of some sort. I'll get the next one, show the choppers. Oh, sorry, not the choppers. It's going to date, sorry. What? If you're really interested in the dating,
yeah, go on.
Is we look for sequences in here that have tephra, which come from volcanic eruptions and conglomerates. And these tephras can be dated with archaeomagnetic techniques, with potassium argon techniques, but of course as the further back we move in time, we have far worse techniques for dating. Now when we look at what we're doing in Northumberland, the Scottish borders and so forth, it's very rare that we cannot use radiocarbon dating. Usually you're able to get some sort of carbon. And the best dates can get you to, what would you say, Chris?
30 years.
50 years, 20, plus minus 25 years, and you can statistically manipulate them. Now, if you have to work with things like uranium-232 and uranium-238 dating, where you're looking at the decay of the half-life of certain radioactive materials, the errors will come in at 500,000 years sometimes. And if you wonder why can't we be more precise, it is because we just cannot apply any more accurate dating, except when we've got volcanic material. And that's why we can come in at about 2.6 million years ago with a fair amount of accuracy in these regards. But a lot of the other sites will have plus-minus margins anywhere between 25,000 to 250,000 years. And I'm afraid there's no way around that. You can begin to apply radiocarbon dating after about 80,000 years, but strictly speaking, you're struggling any time earlier than 40,000 years. It has to be extremely pure deposits and so forth. So we're giving you very broad dates because we can't give you anything else at the moment. It's much like geologists don't think it's a problem. If the Cheviot Hills are dated to 289 to 277 million years ago, it doesn't cause a huge amount of grief for igneous geologists. It causes a massive amount of grief for studying early hominid remains, as you might imagine. And these are the offending specimens that have forced us to reconsider all of human evolution. They don't look like a great deal, and they're actually based on what are essentially little cobbles that were found in riverbeds, and they're volcanic, but they show some very distinctive strike marks and so forth. And these are choppers. You just hold one end and you chop away to break bone and so forth. Incidentally, we think choppers are very popular because we don't really think these creatures are hunting very much. There's still a supposition that we're looking at animals that will eat mainly vegetable foods and they will scavenge meat rather than hunt. And this has always been a difficulty when we look at hunter-gatherers. How much did they actually kill and how much did they scavenge? It's a fair question, because if you find an animal that's wounded and is dying and you follow it and it's a big animal, that's a lot of easy free meat for you to have. And hunting them is problematic in some instances as well. And especially with tools like this, could you imagine taking down large animals? It's not very good. It would be difficult. However, do bear in mind that we are only seeing the stone tools. What about bone arrows, bone spear, or arrows, I'm sorry, no arrows at this side, but spears and things of this sort. There was a South African archaeologist that wrote widely in the 30s and 50s. I think his name was Raymond Dott. And he came up with this terribly unwieldy term called the osteodentocratic industry. And what that means is he suggested that all the old tools are actually based chiefly on bone and antler and things of this sort. And it is extremely rare to see them survive in the archaeological record. Again, he made a very good point, and it's something that we shouldn't dismiss, but it's extremely difficult to argue from an absence of evidence that these things probably survived, but we will never find them. Certainly we see spears and so forth. Clapton's spear, for instance, is almost 250,000 years old. There's an older one in Germany at Bilsingshagen that's about 300,000 years old. We assume these things existed, but an assumption doesn't get us very far. So if we really want to follow the Occam's razor, we would just have to suggest that it did not survive. What we can see, though, is these people were not foolish, that they were selecting raw material. They were choosing specific volcanic rocks that could fracture, the properties of fracture. So they're not just sitting smacking any stone, they're actually doing a quality selection. Now, whether it's a logical quality selection, that they're walking and picking it up, or they've just learned from rote, much like animals will know that the red berries are riper than the green berries, therefore I will eat them first, things of this sort. We just cannot know that at the time. But certainly there's a degree of cognition or cognitive development that's involved in that. And here's a closer image of these. And these continue to be produced. And you can almost see how that would be a chopper by holding it here, and then you'd sit and chop away. And they have some very characteristic signs, the bolts of percussion, and strikes where they've taken other choppers. So we're quite confident that we're looking at deliberately fashioned tools. These are not accidental collections of broken rocks that have been found in the riverbed and so forth. So they've been producing these tools. They've been selecting specific types of material to make them. However, as excited as we are about these finds and pushing it back to 2.6 million years, we have to contrast that with what we see in current chimpanzee behavior. How old is the chimpanzee behavior? Is it possible that all these higher primates in Africa were developing tools and using tools of various sorts? Currently, we can't say anything sensible about that. It's certainly a possibility that we mustn't dismiss it all. How am I doing on time?
About 50 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, let's look at us wandering out of Africa. And this is an interesting beast you've probably never heard of, Homo ergaster. You might not know that name, but you know what we used to call him, Homo erectus. So it's another subdivision that we've created. And usually Homo ergaster is used as an early form of Homo erectus, because Homo erectus evolved somewhere around 1.78 million years ago in East Africa, probably older now, and I'll show you why. And it doesn't vanish until 50,000 years ago in East Asia. So it's by far the most successful hominid that we have ever had on this planet. And there's been, if you recall the Hobbit man that's recently been found, Homo floresiensis, there's a very good argument that it's a dwarf Homo erectus, although there are other arguments that are quite contrary to that. But I certainly, when you look at the interior of the skull, if you bear in mind how pliable our bones are as infants, our muscle tissue leaves marks, our organs and muscle tissues leave marks on the interior of the bones as we're growing. And you can see by taking a negative impression of the skull that the brain actually has a very different structure from modern humans. So we're not looking at modern humans, despite these assertions by a couple of the Australian archaeologists, one of whom was disciplined for being viciously critical of his colleague for no particular reason. But they were suggesting that these Hobbit men actually represented dwarf populations that it was a family that had suffered from a specific form of dwarfism. If you look at the other indicators in the bones, the whole brain structure is not human. It's not like us at all. There's not the same neofrontal cortex development and so forth, and it corresponds much more closely with Homo erectus. So even though I say the last Homo erectus in these days is 50,000 years ago, we might have to say 10,000 years ago if we collapse the Hobbit man with that as well. Now, in this area, we have, again, in some of these sites, Krookham, Homo, there's Addis Ababa, and Hadar, that we found an early form of Homo erectus, and that's what they call Homo ergaster nowadays. Okay. You don't ever need to worry about this nomenclature, because as soon as you begin to learn it, I guarantee you will change it. It is just the way this has been going on. There are monographs, papers on why it should be ergaster rather than something else. It's essentially hair splitting, because I don't think we are in a position to differentiate new species based on the skeletal evidence, not when we are able now to extract DNA. Because in many respects, there's a little find from Russia we'll talk about next week, the Denisova cave, where they took the DNA from that, and it's a completely different species. It's probably an archaic hominid closer to Homo erectus, but you wouldn't know from the skeletal remains. So I think that the DNA is going to be the watershed moment in these studies. So certainly, these two are roughly contemporary, Homo habilis and Homo ergaster. And it's interesting, habilis was what was associated with what we formerly thought were the oldest tools in Olduvai Gorge. Now, Homo ergaster, the most exciting part about that is the first expansionist hominid that we see. Because if we see them arrives about 1.9 million years, can I get to the... Sorry, I'll just try to situate in where we are. We're sort of pushing up this way. These are lines that go and die off and so forth. These are the Australopithecines that break off. And that's the line that we have up here. And that's where we are. So now we've got something very interesting that's happening. Can I get the next one, please? Big eyes, a barrel chest, slightly taller, smaller set of teeth, suggesting that maybe they're eating a broader diet, maybe using fire. The teeth will react very, very quickly to that. Can I get the next? And a bigger brain, 700 to 900 cubic centimeters. So we think maybe fire is creeping in at this time. And most importantly, too, over occipital bones and parietal bones, the basis of it, we look at the jaws as well, because if you have to chew raw food, you need very strong jaws. And that's why I don't think human teeth can penetrate flesh, whereas a dog can tear you apart. And it's all the musculature that they have from being hunters and so forth. Even a little dog could puncture your skin and so forth, whereas we can't do it. We don't have that kind of force in our mandibles and so on. So we begin to see the reduction of the musculature. And again, that's very strongly suggestive that the food is being processed. You do not need this raw food anymore. And it's becoming more gracile. Sorry, Chris, can I get this? And here's where we think Ergaster is. You can see it's somewhere halfway between. It shows archaic forms, then you've got and you're looking at aging millions of years and cranial capacity. As interesting enough, we'll see next week, Neanderthals have bigger brains than we do. It's not the brain. Skip that one? Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about teeth. Now this is the locomotion of them. They're much better. They have full bipedalism, and we can tell largely when we look at the pelvis and so forth that they're not just standing up occasionally and then getting back down on all fours. They're walking upright the entire time, and in fact they're also quite well suited to running at this time. How much you want to read into this? I shouldn't tell you all these trade secrets, but they're based on a lot of computer models that I don't know if you would trust. Do you remember the famous film about the Sasquatch? It was walking, and they did the computer models, and they said that could not have been a human by the locomotion. And of course, last year, the chap who faked it said it was me and an ape human. It was a human. So be very wary about what we will say concerning a number of these things. Because, of course, without the muscles, it might not walk the way we do, but it might be bipedal nonetheless. So we have to be very careful. But there is a general agreement that we're seeing a creature that has greater endurance for long distance walking. And it wouldn't have suffered from back problems and hip problems as much because it was fully adapted to walking. So social structure and behavior. Certainly Ergaster's got fire. And I'll show you the clearest evidence that we've got for fire in there too. It's also been suggested that there are climatic changes that have triggered their movement out of Africa. But of course, having fire and being able to have communal sharing and preparation of food, these might have been adaptive advantages to the other, vis-a-vis the other species that you see in East Africa. And it might have permitted them to expand their population. And expand they did, because very, very suddenly, at about 2 million years, we seem to see them in East Asia and in Eurasia. And it's something that has never been picked up before. They're also making different tools. And these are hand axes. These are Acheulean hand axes, named after a site called Saint-Achille in France. They persist for a long time. We have Acheulean hand axes in Britain. Box Grove has beautiful ones. You only go to the British Museum to have a look. Again, we don't have them because of glacial advance, but they were undoubtedly here, I would think. They are used until about 35,000 years ago. The same tool production. They're bigger and more sturdy things, and they also seem to be the subject of a lot of stylistic interest, actually. People begin to make them. But the curious thing with these tools, and we'll pick up on this next week, is that they never occur east of what's called the Mobius line in India. Does this represent an early migration out before the hand axes were produced? And that population in East Asia never gets the impulses, it's largely an isolated population? Or is something else afoot? Well, currently we can't tell you. And this is how you make them. You produce these. And what we used to call the Clactonian industry, the chopper industry, turns out to be the waste from the production of hand axes. So these Clacton sites are just the waste products where they've taken the hand axes away. You can see how the chopper industry almost anticipates this, where you're knocking bits off, and now you've got this core tool that's in existence. Now, let's look at these early sites very quickly, because this sets us up for next week. These are the early sites at about 2 million years ago. And suddenly, out here, anywhere between 1.8 and 2.1 million years ago, and here are problems with the dating at Trin, we've got a site, Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster. And then we have Dmanisi, and then we have Lantian, and we have another one in northern China that's about 1.7 million years. So it seems very rapid, and certainly in the context of what preceded it is rapid, but do bear in mind that 2 million years to 1.88 million years ago, that's 120,000 years. You can crawl on your hands and knees from Africa to Georgia in 120,000 years if you could live long enough. So it seems to be, by decimalizing it, it seems to be much more rapid than it really is. But nonetheless, something is happening. Something has triggered an expansion out of Africa, and indeed within Africa, because we're being pushed up to being Hanesh and Titinith in Algeria and Morocco and so forth. So there's also an internal expansion. And curiously enough, Europe will come in onto this. We didn't think it did before, but Spain has been leading extraordinarily interesting research in the Orthe Valley and so forth. It's pushing them now back to about 1.6 million years, which will carry on from next week. Paleolithic Europe is a rather different issue. There's suggestions in Israel that there are a couple of sites that are about 2.2 million years ago, and they've looked in the Levant, all over the Levant, looking for these early sites, as you must expect them to cross somehow, and they've so far been elusive. So it's Trino and Dmanisi that are the early sites. And here we have Dmanisi, 1.8 to 1.5. It's recent, they've been very well dated to 1.88 million years. Trino, 1.8. So we're seeing a very, very quick move up. Ubadia might be 2 million years old. We've got one in the Rirat Valley that may be 2 million years old. It's missing things. And now 1.8, 1.6 in Spain. So what's happened? What's happened at this point that's pushing Ergaster out of Africa or making it expand out? Is it population numbers? It's a very difficult one to answer. We have to go to models, so skip over this dispersion in Africa. There's been arguments about how these tools made. Mode 1 is the earliest, very simple. Mode 2, it's been suggested that there's a higher population level, and this is how you can transmit that hand axe culture. Now, a lot of these have been written up in the United States. And American archaeologists are extremely good, very factually based, but their greatest weakness lies in their love for statistics. It makes perfect sense if you're doing work in America. It's vast landscape, and possibly no one's ever done work. You have to statistically prioritize this. But they take these models into all the studies as well. So I don't know how convinced you're going to be about models like that. But they've postulated population rise, a reduction of available resources, an expansion of social territory. And bear in mind, over 100,000 years, just incremental growth and expansion of your hunting territory by 1 kilometer might take you extremely far afield in many ways. And of course, there's this completely unquantifiable aspect of humans, the wanderlust, that we just move. We want to move, we want to be left in peace. Even though it's unquantifiable, it's very difficult to understand, we shouldn't dismiss it, because this is an inalienable aspect of human behavior. Yes, fire is invented. Well, certainly fire is important. This is Gary Larson, who read Archaeology, and hence he will pick on archaeologists very much. You will see many of his cartoons. But certainly the introduction of fire is vital. You would not have made it into northern China, you would not have crossed those mountainous regions and been able to largely survive as a primate without fire in the Crookham. So certainly we have the proxy evidence of reaching into Georgia, Pakistan, China, and indeed even in northern Africa and Morocco, in the Atlas Mountains where we've had some of these early sites, that it must have been. So there is an adaptive technological advantage that would have pushed population or allowed population to be pushed outwards. And here are the Middle Eastern possibilities. These are Ubudaya, and again you can see the choppers, 2.6 million. So this first movement we have, here's Indonesia, and here's the environment of Indonesia. It's found in this valley. And as you can imagine that the first movement out with Africa comes without the hand axis, and then the hand axis evolved within Africa. So something curious has gone on there, and we're going to look at greater detail rather, in the next lecture. So it's most likely oldest, 1.88 million years, and that's the oldest site out with of Africa, the oldest unequivocal site, with the exception of the Israeli one, which may or may not be older than that. And Trinum. And here it is, a largely complete cranium. 3 largely complete crania that were found in Indonesia. And they're certainly archaic Homo erectus, hence they were called Homo ergaster. And there was, again, following the ancient tradition, where you find it, you get to call it after that. Some people have called it Homo georgicus, because it's Georgian and so forth. We're trying to avoid that sort of thing nowadays, but you will see it in the literature. But we certainly see this archaic form that comes out of Africa at this time. So formally, again, we would have argued that we didn't see any settlement in Asia until about 1 million years ago. It happens very, very quickly, this migration. We don't quite understand it. Now, what happens hereafter is extremely complex as well, and there are little odds and ends that we have to put together, trying to reconcile different strands of evidence. Because it seems that these species, where we might formally argue that the species of Homo erectus in Europe was evolving into Neanderthal, we're not necessarily going to dismiss that possibility, but then it was assumed Neanderthal carried on to us. Now we seem to see this as Homo erectus becoming Neanderthal and then becoming extinct, and may or may not have contributed to our DNA. And our Asian colleagues, in one of these perversions of history, under the Cultural Revolution of Chairman Mao, they were pushing this idea that the Asiatics evolved out of Asian Homo erectus on strictly political propaganda purposes. But again, the perversion is that it may actually be true, coming on with the new data that we're seeing. It's just very odd that something may indeed have gone in a different direction in East Asia. Fortunately, the Chinese are doing a lot of excellent research nowadays. They're digging, and trying to keep up with what they're throwing into the Journal of Human Evolution. It's very, very difficult. But they've certainly come up with some very, very good sites that cannot be dismissed. And even though the title of next week's lecture is Paleolithic in Europe, I'll take some artistic license and we'll throw in some of the Chinese material, because it is so important to contrast with what's happening in China and what's happening in Europe. Why are things slightly different? So essentially, when we look at the human evolution, you have to bear in mind that it's in a terrible state of flux at the moment. And they're better arguments than others, but there is no unequivocal truth out there just yet. It has been transformed. Since I did these studies 20-some years ago, it seemed so simple, and it's collapsed. The framework's collapsed about 3 times since then. And it's been collapsing under the weight of genetics, demographic studies, new finds, and just a change in paradigm and so forth. But we'll follow some of those paradigms next week, and we'll see how it directly relates to the British Isles. even though we will not have it here in Northumberland, except under the most extraordinary conditions, it is well worth considering that we did have this occupation here. The only reason it is not visible is because of the damage of the advancing glacial ice. I'll give you a few examples from Denmark and Finland where we do actually have deposits that were found in extraordinarily unusual circumstances, where the ice glid over lakes, for instance, and those deposits were sealed and they'd drawn up bones that were split for marrow extraction. And in Finland, one of the caves got sealed rather than crushed. It got sealed. So there is the possibility that will always exist in places like the west coast of Scotland and so forth, that we will one day find this evidence. But don't allow the absence of evidence to suggest that this was not a landscape occupied by these archaic hominids. It's just that our glacial history militates against this survival. So we'll carry on this thread from Georgia onward. And I'll try to concentrate a great deal on what we have as the earliest European evidence, the most recent European. So we'll look largely at Spain, but then we'll look at what's happening in Hakefield, in Suffolk and Norfolk, where we actually are now looking at 3/4 million to 1 million years ago. The early sites, some of the early sites in all of Northern Europe. Again, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have expected this. Now we're well on. We're pushing occupation ever further.
Are you all right to take some questions? If
Yes,
anyone's got any
of course.
questions? Does anybody wish to ask Kristian anything? There we go, straight up.
On one of the earlier slides, you show Homo going into East Asia and across, and it seems to be across the sea.
Yes, there's.
I mean, was the sea there, or how did they cross the sea? If there was.
This expansion is occurring in the Pleistocene, which, as a rule, we just arbitrarily delimited at 2 million years ago. So it's the most recent glacial cycle place in Europe. In these periods, you have maximum extension of ice in North America and in Northern Europe, and it drops sea levels. For instance, in the last glacial, our sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. So the North Sea's dry land were connected largely to northwestern France and on the south coast and so on. By using the contours, the bathymetric contours, this would have been largely connected land, and this was known in the earlier time as Sunda land. Does that ring a bell with anyone? There's an extremely deep trench that runs between there and Australia, that at the lowest sea level, it is still about 60 to 100 miles of open water to cross. And what we'll see here, what we'll see in the next lecture, is about 50, 60,000 years ago they have indeed crossed into Australia, which must be proxy indicator of some maritime capacity in there. But yeah, it looks like this was largely connected land at the time. So if we drop the sea level by 120 meters, a lot of Indonesia would have been connected, although there would have been isolated islands in extremely deep water. And similarly, though, although the British Isles would have been connected to the continent, Spain and Africa would not have. The Strait of Gibraltar is far too deep. And that was breached in the order of 60 million years ago. So the Mediterranean flooding is part of remote mammalian ancestry, not an archaeological issue.
When you talk about tools, and you can push back from 1.9 million to 2.7 million or whatever the hominid use of tools.
Yeah.
But you also talk about chimpanzees
Yes.
using tools. Now, are you making a distinction between chimpanzees using tools and hominids making tools?
No, the chimpanzees are actually producing them. The question we've got is, when did the chimpanzees begin using tools? Did they somehow learn that? Is it independently developed amongst the groups, or is it of extreme antiquity? We don't know, and this was what Professor Stafford was arguing. We have to be very wary, because as much as we can learn, so can chimpanzees. So because the chimpanzees are doing it now doesn't mean that it's necessarily of extreme antiquity. It might be something that one little group caught on to, it developed. But it may be that they were all producing tools, and it could be an extremely ancient tradition. And believe it or not, there's a perverse stream in archaeology that now excavates chimpanzee sites. so if you're tired of humans, there's always chimps to excavate. So.
Yeah, I think there's something that you were saying at the beginning about different species of hominid learning from another like that. But like the chimpanzees, the idea of some sort of parallel evolution going on, completely independent of different species.
It could easily happen. In a sense, and we move into the territory of Jungian archetypes and so forth, we do share a common physiology, and a much maligned term in archaeology you'll hear is phenomenology. It's borrowed a lot from Heidegger and that. But essentially, it really, that we can perceive the world in only so many different ways because of how our bodies are structured. And they are not terribly dissimilar amongst all the higher primates. So it is not surprising that the same sorts of suggestions can be made amongst different primates, that I will split the stone, I can do that again, and I can continue to use it. So independent parallel development is certainly just as cogent as cross-fertilization culturally or through observations.
I mean, as you said, the chimpanzees haven't evolved because they're adapted perfectly well to their environment. There hasn't been the external environmental pressure which drives evolution.
But it might not drive physiological evolution, but it may drive behavioral evolution. And these are things that we don't know enough about. And we are so early into these studies. For as much as we present these evolutionary studies as something that has some sort of scientific rigor, do bear in mind that the first shots across the bow to indicate the antiquity of humans was the work by Mary and Louis Leakey, and that was in the 1950s. We're scarcely 50, 60 years into this discipline. And now we add into that genetics. It's only 20 years since we mapped the genome. We still don't know what it does. And there are all sorts of curious little studies in there. So there are a number of variables that I would be loath to make a categorical statement for. You can only say currently that this is the way it is looking. And again, if you bear in mind how few sites, how little data that we have, it's statistically farcical to make these statements about us. Yes?
One thing I never understood is, if you talk about the chimpanzees developing in West Africa and Central Africa, what was unique about that environment which stopped the same thing happening in the Amazon area in South America?
We don't know. It's a suggestion. One of the suggestions is that there are no higher primates in South America. I think that we see these. Like,
what caused them not to evolve there?
Yes, it's because you'd assume it's the same sorts of environments.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
But there's also this argument of the antiquity of the higher primate is an old world phenomenon. These branched off, so maybe there was an evolutionary pressure that went more into their physiological adaptation rather than maybe cognitive abilities. Because when you look at East Asia, for instance, you have the orangutan, which is a very intelligent, clever creature, but then you've got things like gibbons that have developed in a very different way, to massive upper body strength and can swing from trees and things very, very different from the others. But there are only a series of postulates that we can offer you of why this may or may not have happened. Yes, I'm afraid it's nothing that just has a ring of, I think we're onto something. We're still lacking.
So is the only way they came to America was across the bridge?
When the continents divided, that's relic populations of, we're looking, I don't know, 50, 60 million years ago.
Right.
And that's isolated them in the same core area. Right. We're looking at plate movements in extremely remote, it's a tertiary period, I think, something like that. Yes.
Can we link the spread of these early species out of Africa to the increase in brain size? You're talking about wanderlust, which is a very modern human thing.
I think so. Certainly, we see an increase. If you compare Australopithecus gari, the first tool producer, to Homo erectus, we have almost a doubling of the cranial capacity, which we assume is not necessarily intelligence, but there's development in probably neofrontal brain. So you can see in one of the images there's less prognathism and so forth. And yeah, that could definitely be an
More
element.
emotional awareness.
Yeah, emotional awareness, social awareness, which is very closely related to emotion, social bonds and so forth. These could all be inextricably linked. We don't know how, but again, we're only 20, 30 years into MRI scanning, for instance, in understanding how these linkages exist in our brains. And we're talking about things like neural pathways now, and thresholds and epigenetics, and what 20 years ago we promised completely collapsed because we realized it's not necessarily the gene, it's what triggers the gene interactivity. So this is even there with chimpanzees, for instance. When we're looking at the evolutionary studies, the geneticists have suggested that it's not the genes, it's how they're organized, and they've suggested things called higher activity regions. And in humans, higher activity regions where the cells are extremely susceptible to mutation and so forth, all tend to be brain and neurological. Whereas in chimpanzees, they're not. But they've linked this to potentially, I'm trying to remember what it is. It's a curious thing one of these scholars picked up on. The chimpanzees very rarely get cancer. And they want to know why do humans get it and chimps don't. And they were hoping that they could find some genetic signal that was linked to both. Turns out it has a lot to do with, I believe, their cell structure is more acidic, and that more or less prevents any of the cancer to get a hold. But for our cells being non-acidic means that we can develop the higher neurological cell growth a lot easier. So there's some very odd things in there that we're going to learn the hard way, I'm afraid, on some of these studies. But you can see how the study's being pushed from many, many different directions, from veterinary science to behavioral to psychology to just finds that, like the Hobbit Man destroyed so much. So, no one expected it to happen. It pops up, and we have to completely revise the framework.